Welcome to CrossPlatform podcast, where we discuss how to solve productivity problems across platforms. I'm Augusto Pinaud,
And I'm Mark Gelwicks.
and today we are talking about Project Post-Mortem. We are recording this after both finish a long, long weekend of Oktoberfest. I don't know if it
Yeah.
was that long, but that's how long it felt. Um,
hmm
It was fantastic, but it felt very long. And as we were discussing the topic, you know, what happened when you finish this project? Oktoberfest is a project for the people listeners that don't know that it's a year of preparation, and right now we are in the probably the only 2 weeks of the year where we don't talk about Oktoberfest technically. So and the next week or the week after, we start planning 2024 and what we did.
hmm
So the reason is we thought about this topic is, well, postmortem could happen on two kinds of projects: those who are actually done and you finish and there is nothing else to do with this project, and those that you are going to do it again. You were going to come back next year and do it again. And there are difference. There is intelligence to collect and more. So that's the topic of today.
Yeah, this is one of those things that you're right. We both finished these year-long engagements, and they're recurring engagements. It's not just a once and done type of project. And anyone who's worked in pretty much any sort of a professional field will encounter this type of an engagement where you have something that you are working so actively on for the entire duration of that particular project that when it comes to the end, it's that weight off your shoulders temporarily. It's that deep breath of, okay, we're all done here. What do we do now? And this is why I wanted to explore this idea of doing a project post-mortem. And some people don't particularly care for the term because post-mortem is assuming that the project's dead. Um, I, I think the effort has ended and thinking about it that way. So I use the term post-mortem all the time for this, and I'm going to continue to use it. But the real thing that I wanted to focus on is this challenge that we have when you're dealing with a large enterprise and lots of people involved in a big project. A post-mortem makes sense. It's your opportunity to sit down and review all the learnings that you've gathered during the life cycle of that particular project and then improve and take those learnings and theoretically put those learnings into practice to do a better job on the next project and maybe even the next time you do this same project. But I wanted to explore this a little bit because you and I are in a common situation that a lot of people find themselves where it's a very small group involved, or if you have a very large project and you're the only one doing it. And how do you have a post-mortem when you're really the person who did all the heavy lifting? Now, I'm not saying in our Oktoberfest examples we did all the heavy lifting, but because by no means is that an example or is that accurate. But when you look at large projects that you do as individuals, is there a need for a post-mortem? How do you do that? How do you make it worthwhile? And what are some mechanics that you put into place to be able to gather those learnings as well as put them into action? So I think this is going to be more of an exploratory discussion into how we do this individually and see what the common grounds are where you and I both interact or both operate on these types of
Mhm.
ideas and how we approach it. So let's start with, when do you think it is time to do that post-project review? Do you like to do it early, late? What's the gap and what
I
triggers
believe
that
the
gap?
earliest, the better. Not necessarily everybody agrees into that, and actually, our event was on the 30th of September and our meeting, it's going to be almost 15 days later. And I think that's a lot, okay? Because there are things that you forget that are better to
Mhm.
grab fresh. Yes, when you're still tired of the event, that's good because that's when you remember how many of the pains that you experience on these kind of big things, and you capture them while they're fresh. There are things that 2 weeks later feel like, oh well, yeah, that was challenging, but yeah, that's fine, we survived. No, you survive, but if you don't try to pull this pain away, then the chance to remember and improve for next year, it's hard, it's difficult.
Hmm.
It's so, because for sure, if you don't consider it's that important in 2 weeks, trust me, in 12 months, you forgot about it. And you're going to remember the next year event when you get there and say, oh, we did this again. So um, I can give you an example. For us, the location of our food, uh, this event has been done 13 times and food has been there 13 times. And this time we had less volunteers in general. So the food on the way it was distributed should have been done differently. Why? To maximize the volunteers that we have. So those are the kind of things that somebody need to capture. Right? Somebody in that committee need to capture and say, hey, we need to organize our stuff also based on the number of volunteers that we have. How many do we have to be able to make sure? How many do we need? What is the minimum number? Can we survive if we get only 50% of what we volunteers we are asking? And what that means for the organization of this event? Because can you run on a skeleton crew? The answer is yes. But the more important question is how long? So all those things, are important. For example, for us, um, one of the things we changed, we had, the Oktoberfest, and we have an trick or trade, baskets where you can buy tickets and put your ticket in the baskets. Last year, the system that was to buy those tickets, okay, was too cumbersome for a night where people is making a line and drinking beer. Okay, it
Hmm.
was not convenient. Okay, it was a great system when you were sober, but after you
Hmm.
had two drinks, that was too cumbersome, and that was one of the things that was captured and improved this year. But it is important to capture those things. For me, my wife and I have moved 16 times in 20 years. Okay. So for us, moving was a project, and it is a project who
Hmm.
have a checklist who comes with a post-mortem. Okay. Why? Well, because we have done it so much that it is now something that happened. And we need to be very, very aware of what we need, we have the checklists what we are going to do, and then evaluate after every move what we did better
Hmm.
this time, what we didn't do as good this time. And when you start looking into those things, they are a lot of projects like that. Traveling, same thing. We have a checklist and we evaluate the checklist. And a couple of years ago, no, maybe more, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, after one trip, we were sitting in, having dinner after the trip, and we were reviewing, doing the post-mortem. And I remember my daughter, who at the time was 10, look and say, oh, that's not true. We need to think about this and this and this and this. Okay.
Hmm.
And it was very interesting because we didn't thought about including her at that point into that post-mortem. We were discussing us, but it was very
Hmm.
refreshing to see her injecting the things that they may be out of your view because you don't think on those things, but for them were important. And then we even went and create into that list things for the kids that otherwise we probably will have not thought about.
So if we think about the original question of the amount of time past the end of a project, my gauge on that is typically if the project lasted, If the effort and the project execution lasted less than 2 months, I would say absolutely do it within a week on the outside. There's no reason to wait much longer. If the project execution took anywhere from 3 to 6 months, you can easily space it to a 2 week period.
Mhm.
When you get to a year-long project, I don't think it's unrealistic to actually have your post-mortem occur almost 3 to 4 weeks afterwards. And the reason being is because there's a recovery period that happens at the end of any major massive project, especially if it involves a huge number of people. People are just had it. The last thing they want to do is think about this thing for a week after or 2 weeks afterwards. Uh, If you've put the proper structures in place during the life cycle of the project, all of the learning should have been captured as you went. So the amount of gap time at the end is more to help people have a clean and fresh set of eyes back on what happened. And I've also found it helps remove some of the emotionality that can often be tied to some of the feedback and some of the ideas because you are not in the heat of execution.
Mm.
So let's talk about that information gathering process. Now we're both talking about year-long projects, and let's keep that point of focus because these are massive things, lots of moving projects, and a high likelihood of those ideas and observations getting lost and to the wayside as you continue to execute over the period of time. So, how do you go through and make sure those learnings are not lost during the cycle of a large project execution?
So I am very particular into the capture. Okay, I'm very, very good at capture. And so one of the things I do is I tend to get to these meetings and really capture not only what is my area, but all the other comments that sometimes, people do casually and say, oh yeah, last year really the sauerkraut, was not the best. Like, well, there's a sauerkraut because that's the kind of things that it was a casual comment, and I was actually 3 years ago was the dessert. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody said we had comments like that. So it was, eh, okay, no, great. So I captured that on that meeting, on that. And when it came the time to the meeting, to the next one, and we get to start discussing food, I say, what are we going to do about this? And people
Mm-hmm.
looking at me like, well, I capture on this meeting, 9 months
Mm-hmm.
ago that the people were, oh yeah, it is true. And those kind of things bring the opportunity to improve. Many of these improvements, some are not even worth it, but some of them are required to be listening to that conversation. And because they're not necessarily big problems. Hey, if the
Mm-hmm.
sweets were not terribly good, fine. The rest of the event went fine. We can continue serving that not terrible good one, or we can use the opportunity to improve. So one thing that also happened in the past was there were, we have it's a parish, so we have younger crowd, older crowd, and the older crowd were complaining that during the food they didn't have a quiet place to eat, and they have with the
Mm-hmm.
live band. So again, we create a second tent and then put the divider, the protection on the walls of that tent, not towards the back, but towards the front. So that way that, filter a little bit of the music is by
Mm-hmm.
any way, shape, or form, it's now quiet, but it's not as loud as when you are on the main tent. So, but those are the kind of things that tend to disappear. Okay, because you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned it is casual, but it's not important, it's not critical. So that knowing that that's one of my skills, that capture component, I go into this meeting with really the pencil ready to try to capture as many of these subtleties as humanly possible.
Yeah, if you have a team where you have someone specifically in charge of process management and process improvement, uh, those those are the candidates to do that detail level of capture. If you don't have someone who is experienced in process management, experienced in change management or process improvement, it can become problematic because people they don't really know how to capture these
Mhm.
types of things, and they have to be guided all the time. One of the things that I will do when I'm working with a team or just even a group, if someone is voicing, "Hey, we should do this next time," that's a trigger phrase right there. Absolutely. My right response to them is not, "Yeah, you're right." It's write that down or email that to me or email that to your site. Capture it somehow. If it's important enough them for them to go through the exercise of capturing that idea, then it's important enough to consider and think about later on. And there is an important split that we have to put on these types of observations and ideas. And that's the difference between factual questions and factual observations and anecdotal ones. Your statement of, and this is a common thing because I've heard the same things. You know, if we use the Oktoberfest example, um, the sauerkraut should be better next year. That's an anecdotal one. That's an emotional one. There's no
Right.
factual base for
No,
that.
no.
There's nothing that is indicating of that there is an operable problem to solve. And I think that's one of the most important things during the capture process is to be looking with a critical eye at the feedback and the information that's being gathered as to whether or not it's an emotional reaction or is there something actionable underlying it? And that's where you start to have the composite. If you have 20 people say the sauerkraut should be better, that builds itself into a factual analysis.
Correct.
And the reason why I say that is because every one of these capture points we should be able to look at as to the degree of impact that capture point should have. Now, you can't really do that when you capture it. You can't tell somebody, "Oh, that's a really great idea. Oh, that's a terrible idea," because you don't know the quality of that idea until you go back and look at it, critically and analytically. But at that point, any idea is usable, so it does need to be captured. For capture on a long-term project, again, if you have a designated body who's responsible for that, I typically recommend people set up a system, set up a page, set up some sort of a capture form uh, to have it digitally captured. Don't just leave it all sitting in emails and things like that. Create a composite list. I don't recommend you try to filter and sort and analyze the information during the flight of the project unless something that you get told has an actual immediate impact to the quality of what you are doing right now. And that's probably the first threshold that you have to look at any of these ideas with is, does this make a difference right now? Is this solving an immediate problem? Or is this something that we need to think about before executing? So if you go through and look at the different steps and you say, okay, I'm going to capture all of this feedback from 20, 25 different people, or they're capturing their own feedback. And you know that often when people capture their own feedback, you'll get the same feedback from like 6 or 7 people. They'll
Mhm.
all have the same idea, and often they'll think they had the idea first over everybody else, when they all actually had just the same idea at the same time. Uh, but that all comes back to a point of measurement, and this is one of the other pieces that I apply to this stuff. And I'm
So
going to
I'm
ask you,
going to answer that question in a
yeah,
very personal way. I
okay,
capture, okay,
okay,
and I capture because over the years I understand that people have different skills,
hmm
and not everybody is good at capture. Okay. Actually, I was watching Ahsoka, the Disney
Mhm.
TV series. Okay, and there is a moment where this character is building a life saving. Okay, and the
Mhm.
person in charge of the room is saying, "What you are doing? I have a system." Okay, and the guy says, "I have a system too." And the owner of the room respond, "No, what you have is a methodology. This is not a system because it doesn't have any operation procedure." And I laugh very much at that because
Mhm.
that is the reality of everybody. It's not that you have a system or I don't have a system or we both have system. It's that there are systems could be absolutely and completely incompatible.
Mhm.
So what I have learned is if it takes me little to capture and have that information available for me, I capture and keep that information for the next discussions. I don't tell people, "Oh, you remember on November 21,
Mhm.
2023, they said the sauerkraut wasn't great." That part of the information is unnecessary. But
Mhm.
when you bring that conversation, and in the case of the food, and we are discussing, okay, on the sauerkraut, then I can ask, hey, do we need to improve this? I remember there was a comment. I don't need to tell them how
Mhm.
well I remember the comment, but I bring it back to the memory of the people because again, one of the things I believe in team building is you bring your strengths forward. So not to put the other ones down, but to push everybody up. Okay. And there's
Mhm.
other people in that organization team that has other skills that I don't have. So when you approach things that way, things tend to flow
Mhm.
better. So because my skill is that I capture and I capture, you know, I this is not about this project only. My mother-in-law texts me, "What is my password for it?" Right? Because she
Mhm.
knows that I have them all in one password. She had a folder and all that information, it is there. So I am very good at capturing and very good at organizing so I can access very quick. And because of that, I have that habit of keeping that amount of knowledge very accessible to bring as comments in meetings. I'm sure
Man,
in
the
certain meetings that also make me a pain on the butt, but that's a different discussion.
it it's an interesting dilemma because one of the behaviors that I like people to develop over time, especially if it's going to be a repeating project over years, is to develop that skill of capturing their observations because I think that's a base skill uh, that everyone should have is be able to take note of their own ideas and observations and be able to pass those on, communicate them effectively. It doesn't mean that I'm asking them to come up with solutions. Solutions are an entirely different
Mhm,
conversation. But often you'll have to sit down, and this is partially where you get into that gap on large postmortems. Sit down with people and walk them through a clear series of steps to retrace their thinking about, what were the observations you had at the very beginning when we hit phase one, when we hit phase two, when we hit phase three, and so on. If they had done the capture work, this will be really easy. Otherwise, they're going to be kind of filling in the gaps. But this does bring out a very important piece, which is what is the degree of impact of each of those items? And this again is where you start to say, okay, I've heard this same comment multiple times during multiple phases of the project, and it doesn't sound like a big deal, but if I've heard it that many times over that much time, it could have a much larger impact just because the nature of time and scale. So being able to start to identify and quantify what each of these impact points are is really important. I have a scale that I apply to things is a piece of feedback or an idea a net zero or a net one idea? And let me explain what that is. If it's an idea that's dealing with a negative occurrence during the execution of the project, there was a problem. This bad thing happened. This didn't work right, whatever. That's a negative value. The the idea, the feedback needs to include a possible way to solve that. Needs to include a positive. And from basic math, if you add a positive to a negative, you get a zero. They cancel each other out, which is the objective you're really trying to get to. You want problems to have solutions. Now, sometimes you won't have one. You may have an observation that does not have a recommendation that goes along with it. It is still a net minus at that point. And that's something that you're going to have to discuss as part of the postmortem or even a separate conversation entirely. And I'll get into that because I think postmortems can turn into just entire clusters if you're not careful.
Right.
The other thing, though, is a net one. And a net one is a positive observation that can have a positive impact on what's going on. So, for example, let's say ticket processing. If you're going through and you're selling tickets, well, you're selling tickets is
Right.
great. You're moving through, you're selling lots of tickets, but you have an idea of how you can make it even better. And it's that even better aspect that makes this a net one idea because you're going to have two positives. You're going to have a positive one, you're going to take it up from this neutral state up into an even better one. The actionable things, the important things that can make your projects better if it's a repetitive project are the net zero ones. Those are the ones that can get rid of that negative drag on your project executions. The net ones, those are nice. Those are helpful, but those also require more conversation because often those are undiscovered countries when it comes to putting something new into action. So let's dig into that a little bit. This idea of having the post-mortem session. Let's say during the lifespan of this project, and we'll say it's a year-long project. The project is finished. You've got 7, 8, 10 people that have been involved in it in various aspects of it as it's gone through its execution. You set up a time to have a post-mortem review. Typically, when you get into that post-mortem review, what have they been like for you?
So there are two reviews for me. There is my review that I do, my own evaluation of the event and what I observe, and then the evaluation of that review that I do after that meeting.
Mhm,
Because again, sometimes you hear things that they may be into your opportunity to improve. So, for
mhm,
example, I mentioned we do the baskets. Okay, so the baskets, it's a process very tedious. You sell a ticket, you write the name and the number of the person on the ticket. It's multiple factor, old manual. So the question is, can we optimize this to speed people through the line? Yes or no? And this year we had three different levels. So one of the things we noticed the first day is, how do you know where to put the ticket? Oh, that was something we could change right there on the side, on the top of the basket, or the box,
mhm,
to put the same color of the ticket. But then we need to capture for next year. Hey, we are going to have multiple tiers. We need multiple colors of tickets to make easier for the people. Maybe think on one of the things idea somebody mentioned on the event was the tablecloth. Keep the color of the tablecloth where you have the baskets on the same color of the tickets, so you have an additional clue. Because we found a lot of tickets on the wrong boxes. Not
mhm.
everybody's paying attention. So make it easier so that people had a better experience.
Yeah, one of the things that I try to notoriously project postmortems that I've seen over the years fall into one of three categories. They fall into a session where everybody kind of sits around and they wait for leadership to say, here's how we fix all the problems that we had. And they don't really engage. That, unfortunately, that happens fairly often. The second is the postmortem turns into a complete, for lack of a better term, bitch session about every
Mhm.
possible thing that went wrong
Right.
without any ways to get it organized. It's just everybody's complaining about it, and it turns into a lot of finger pointing. Also, not a good thing. The best project postmortems that I've seen are the ones where the personalities are extracted out of the conversation.
Yeah.
Because you do have a lot, especially on large projects, you have a lot of personal investment in the end result. And especially during the execution, there's a lot of personality that comes into conversation. And personalities clash. People will differ on ways that problems should have. Some people have a habit of sticking their nose into where it's not supposed to be, not staying in their lane of execution, having the mindset of they can solve all the problems of the project and the world. And if you just listened to them, everything would be fine. But because you didn't, everything went to heck in a handbasket.
Right.
Um, so utilizing a project postmortem with very specific techniques to extract the personality part of it can be very useful. There's a brainstorming technique that I've kind of modified over the years. As a Spider-Man fan, I always call it my Sinister Six, where I will give everybody, we take the project itself and we break it down not into a timeline phase, but major aspects of the project. So,
Right.
for example, if it's something like a major project like this, one of those aspects may be food, one may be beverage, one may be volunteering, one may be grounds, and so on and so forth. And we dig into each one of those, and I give each person 6 post-it notes. And I say, put down on those post-it notes, the 6 biggest problems that you saw with X during the execution of this project. So if we're talking about food, what are the 6 biggest problems you saw with the food during that
Hmm.
period?
That's
Then what we
great.
do
Yeah.
is we take all of those post-it notes and we put them all up on a whiteboard at the same time in front of everybody. I'm not asking anybody to categorize, not asking anybody to organize. I just want them all up there. And I make sure that they're fairly small post-it notes so that people have a hard time reading them from across the room. Because the idea is not to have, oh, that's John's idea, oh, that's Anne's idea, and so on and so forth. It's these are ideas and they're floating out there. And now what we'll do is we'll start moving and grouping them together. And I do that for them in front of the room with them. I'll say, okay, we've got one here. Um, Ticket taking took too long. Put it in a pile. Oh, here's another one about ticket taking took too long. And I go through and I move those into groups. And what it does is it helps develop the commonality of the ideas where people can see, okay, this is obviously a big issue area in this particular topic. This is the one we need to address first. But at no point in this part of the exercise do we try to solve the problem. And this is this is one of the
Correct.
hardest parts of it is keeping the horses reined in because immediately you will get some people who start to say, "Oh, well, if we did this or we did,"
No, no,
it's not what we're
that's not
doing
the
right now.
meeting. Hmm.
We're just trying to identify, and that's kind of why I like the term post-mortem because if you think about like every crime drama, the first thing you're trying to figure out is how did the person die? What killed the person? Not what their motive was, not what led up to it, not how did what did it? And that's what the first steps are in doing this is doing, like I said, my Sinister Six exercise, identifying the villains. We can find all the villains and work them together into those groups. We then take all of that off the board because the last thing I want to do is have all that up there all the time, all this negative. There can be a psychological backlash to this exercise and the fact that if you've got, let's say, for example, 10 people doing this exercise, you suddenly have 60 post-it notes up on the wall that are all problems.
And
And that can be terrifying for some
right.
people that all of a
And
sudden this thing went horribly off the rails and it didn't.
I didn't. Correct. And you made a very important point that this initial meeting is not to solve the problems. Whatever you can identify or comment, it is not to solve the problem. This is a meeting to recall what we observe. And as the next planning event starts, that normally is more weeks in the future, Then we look and review what are those things and if they were really valid or not.
One of the things that I stipulate when doing these exercises, and I will stand on this table and jump up and down quite a bit about, is that this is not a place for executives to participate. Unless you were involved in the direct execution of the project, this is not a time for you to be part of the conversation. Because at that point, the only thing that you can provide is anecdotal observations. You cannot provide any factual first person observations. And
Correct.
without those, it doesn't really help because it carries an unnecessary amount of weight without an equivalent amount of value. I mean, if they want to know everything that comes after the fact, yeah, absolutely, not a problem. But you can't help in this step in the process unless you actually did things, signed your name to them, made them happen, carried things around, stuck tape on walls. Unless you actually physically participated in the execution of this project, this is not your time to provide value.
Mhm.
So, going through this, then, let's say we've started this exercise on this postmortem. Everybody has their, we'll say, gathered learnings. We've gone through the exercise of consolidating together into the main categories. One of the things I don't recommend people do is assigning priority to those categories because any weighting you put on ideas at this point will throw off the entire exercise. So you can't really say that food is more important than parking. Ultimately, it may be, not denying that fact. I'm just saying that at this point in the exercise, it's literally A, B, C, D, E. They are just letters on a line. They are not, this is more important than that thing. That's all, that comes after the fact. So this is a lot of breakdown of gathering. Dealing with repetitive issues within this breakdown and gathering is probably the most important step in this exercise. When you have 4, 5, 6, 7 people giving you the exact same feedback on something, as the facilitator in this, you cannot throw up a flag and say, oh, this looks really important. It's okay to do that in your own notes, but the last thing you want to do is say, hey, you guys are onto something. And here's why. They may totally be onto something, but if you suggest that, that is all they will think about then for the next hour. They will
Mhm.
lock in on that and they will. It's kind of like when you're doing graphic design for someone and you give them a design that is a full color design before giving them a wireframe of something. If you give them the full color design, they will never see past the color.
Correct.
They'll lock into the color and they'll lose track of everything else that you're trying to get them to understand. So keeping things step by step focused on this part of the process really becomes critical. So we've gone through, we've got the basic feedback gathered from everybody. Uh, one of the other things, and how do you handle this is an interesting point of problem because this is usually where this little beastie rears its head. What do you do when people start to get injected into the problem category? Instead of saying that we had a problem gathering tickets, it's Dave was a problem gathering tickets.
Well, and that happened. And I try to again go back to let's state the problem and then find the solution. If was or not was 100% of Dave's problem, let's first identify the
Mm.
issue because this it may look like it was Dave, but it's until we identify fully the issue, we will really not know. And that is important to remind people. Hold on, don't pinpoint on Dave until we really get all the facts and and really understand it is that the process was flawless, or is that the only way that process could have been executed was the way they've executed.
Yeah, I've gotten into this conversation numerous times, and usually the trigger will be someone will get all emotional, and it's typically when you've got two or more people that have been at loggerheads during the execution of the project,
Mhm.
and that bubbles out during that conversation. And at that point, I typically stop the entire conversation. I say, look, before we go any further, we all need to understand one thing about this entire analysis. Something will fail from a process standpoint based on whether it was poorly defined, poorly communicated, poorly understood, or poorly executed. Nowhere in our conversation today are we trying to figure out which one of those four it is. That comes down the road. So we're not worried about exactly how it happened. We're trying to identify the things that happened. And then we'll go through and start to look for the commonalities and things like that. But that definition, communication, understanding, and execution, I find helps get people kind of off the hook for that initial capture. Because we all know a lot of times the problems do come from people. They come from people who don't pay attention to process, or they come from processes that are poorly documented. Lord knows we live with so many of those. Or they're not clearly communicated from the process to the people who are going to execute it. All of those pieces can cause it to go off the rails. And those are actually the easiest things to solve, because notice in none of those four items I just outlined, definition, communication, understanding, or execution, did I say change the process. Changing the process is the hardest of this because
Yep.
it's introducing a factor of unknown.
Well, plus, we need to remember in some of these projects, even if that for you, the process is obvious that is broken, for the person who will execute it is not necessarily broken.
Hmm.
As I mentioned earlier, I am a very techie guy. So for me, any process that you can automate or put in a computer, I'm all on board of that. But we had an issue last year with the tickets, not this event, the past year, where the people in the entrance, the volunteers, were not tech savvy. So one of the complaint was on the system that you have. When somebody asks us to enter the information for their ticket, they were typing A T. You say
Hmm.
Art or Arthur? Arthur. Okay, and then what
Hmm.
the line was not moving anywhere. So
Yep.
this year, and is that a problem on the process? No, the process was flawless. If you get somebody who type, the process is flawless. But you
Hmm.
can't count that everybody who will sit on that volunteer seat can type. So
Hmm.
the process was changed. Consider now what is the weakest link or the bottleneck, and remember that book of Goal Red, the goal, what is the weakest link on the process? Because the process with a certain capabilities could be completely flawless. But what happened when that process has certain bottlenecks? And I give this example to people all the time. I did tech support in my house. And at some point, some years back, my dad needed a new phone. And he went and said, I'm going to get an Android phone. And I say, I only do tech support on iPhones.
Hmm.
Oh, but I want to get an Android. I said, that's fine. But I only do tech support on iPhone. So the first
Hmm.
day he had an issue. How do I do? I don't know. Could I have figured it out? Yes.
Hmm.
Okay. Did I wanted to spend the time figuring it out, trying to see how? No. Okay. Why? Because I understand on the iPhone, okay, I can tell you right now, go to settings, general, here, okay, and I can close my eyes and visualize the menu. On the Android, it will depend on the model, on the phone. So I can't. So you need to get that. May not be the process, may also be what are the bottlenecks on this process.
Yeah. The point you just described of the process working fine, but its ripple effect on other things is something that often is not seen until the heat of the moment. Perfect example of that keyboard entry. There's nothing wrong with the process. The process, as you defined, if you wrote it down, would look perfect. And it could be executed perfectly 99 out of 100 times. But identifying the exceptions, that is really, I think, probably one of the most important parts of the postmortem process is a problem or an observation coming from an exception of the process, or is it coming from an edge case, something that the process did not take into consideration? And I would challenge that yours is actually an edge case. A
Mhm.
slow entry typist created a ripple effect in the process.
Right.
Is there something from a process standpoint that could mitigate that? That's something you would discuss later on, and I'd argue you really can't. So you have to kind of figure out, ways to work around that. But those types of things, so many problems are caused by those fringe cases and develop this exceptionally disproportionate reaction that you will go through and you will make changes to completely coherent processes just to deal with this 1 or 2% edge case. And that's, I think, many times when you look at, especially in business processes, completely useful business processes get undermined because now they're trying to deal with every possible situation. And we all know realistically that that can't be done. You do not have that latitude. Uh, Similar situation, I'll go through this. We pre-sell tickets for our event.
Mhm.
And on one given day, we had pre-sold over 1,000 tickets. So we had a checklist. Now, in theory, best case, the gate would be using a digital scanner or a phone to scan QR codes to immediately be able to recognize someone's online ticket that they purchased, check them in, move them past the door. Everything flows beautifully streamlined. Realistically, that's not how this works. People come up, they don't have their QR code. You can't read it off of their phone. Their screen is dirty. The display is too small. Any number of factors can come in, taking something that should be approximately a 20 to 30-second interaction and turning it into a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. We recognized that last year, literally within the first day. We said, look, scanning this stuff is just not going to fly. Just in the environment we're within, the rails that we're on, it's not going to work. So we immediately started to supply a checklist, a listing of people who had registered for that particular day. So whoever was at the gate could just by last name scan down. Yep, there you are. Check off, move on. Works the same way. Technologically far simpler, but it achieved the same end result. Thought we had the problem licked. What happens when they lose the list? We lost 3 of them this year at the front gate from day to day to day. Now, again, this is one of those things, having done this in the past, I'm like, okay, I'm going to assume that they're going to lose this stuff. So I had printed 5 copies. So luckily it wasn't that big of a deal. But it was one of those situations where a process was changed to deal with exceptions. And then that in itself introduces the new potential, or the potential for new exceptions that has to be mitigated and planned for. So as we continued through this exercise and we're continuing to gather this information, gather the ideas, at what point do you say enough is enough? We've got enough feedback, ideas, inputs to move forward from what killed the patient to how do we keep it from killing the next patient?
Well, the first thing to remember in this particular case that we are post-mortem is this volunteer basis. or it's not volunteer basis.
Mhm.
Okay, because it's different. This is your internal family, or this is, work, or this is a volunteer event, because all those
Mhm.
change on how you can do some things. And I remember at some point, we have, it says, Alicia's, Tomas, my son, got parents, when they get to be very good friends of us, they didn't have kids. And Alicia, my daughter, was their first kid. And they said, I remember when you had that girl and you make them travel with a lunchbox and you count the toys that needed to go. And I thought, okay, that is ridiculous. But that little girl had a checklist of how many. I
Mhm.
mean, she was too little, okay, to write down the checklist. I get it, but which she knew how many toys? 10. Okay, then
Mhm.
everywhere we open that thing, we count 10 back. And this friend of ours, said that she made fun of us for years. Okay, that we were ridiculous until she had the girl and lost the first toy. Okay, and
Mhm.
after that, the checklist came back. So
Yeah.
those sort of things you need to remember. Okay, and adapt based it on that situation. With volunteers, it's difficult. Okay, you need to navigate the political waters of that. With work, it's much simpler, or sometimes simpler. And with the family, well, it
Mhm.
gets the challenge that it is.
That's a really good observation because it does parallel if you're looking at it from a business size project. Imagine on a business team, members of your project team participating in the project for only 1 day or maybe 2 days at the most.
Mhm.
They're going to contribute to the project execution, but their involvement will be limited to 1 or 2 days. How do you get them onboarded? How do you make sure they know exactly what's expected of them? They have what information and material assets that they need to execute their particular role? And what do they do when they're done? With volunteers, it's even that much harder because often the people do not have the level of engagement. They're there to just be a body. They're not there to make, in most cases, a tangible impact to the overall execution. They are filling a role. Well, to fill that role, you have to keep in mind that that role has to be defined for anyone to be able to fill it, not someone who has been aware of what's going on or may have done it 3 times in the past or may have a history of doing that type of work. That may not be who you get at all. So creating roles and defining them in ways so literally anyone can be plugged into them becomes a challenge in volunteer-based projects,
Mhm.
but it's an equal challenge within the business space when you have people popping into your project to work on something. You need a developer for a week to work on a set of screens. You've got a graphic designer who's going to put together a presentation deck for you. Well, you've got them as a resource now. How are you going to best engage that resource? And that's where I go back to the prioritization of the feedback. There is certain feedback, let's say, for example, with a volunteer and that lunchbox and those toys. That's a singular job. On
Mhm.
the grand scheme of the project, it's not going to make or break the entire Oktoberfest,
Correct.
but it is a job and it has to be done and it has to be done well. And the reason why I say that is because if it isn't, it's going to ruin someone's day. And that can have a huge negative overall impact in the perception of the success of the project. We all know the squeaky wheel, at phrase, squeaky wheel gets the grease. Well, the squeaky wheels tend to be the people who have had a minor issue and have turned it into a major
A
drama.
major one.
Yeah. So being able to remember that there are no small jobs, there are only small efforts, that becomes the prioritization of these ideas. This becomes that framework that has to come into play
Right.
and how those pieces together. Now, this is where you start to look for those commonalities, though. if the majority of the ideas that you've been getting and the majority of the feedback revolve around volunteers being able to execute their jobs effectively, volunteers knowing what they need to do, or handoffs between volunteers and things like that, that's not the volunteer problem. That's not a problem of the volunteers themselves. That goes back to those 4 items that I was talking about. That could be a definition problem. It could be a communications problem. It could be an understanding problem. And it could be an execution problem. But that's a different exercise because that means if you fix it at a bigger level, it can have a greater impact on the entire project in the future.
Correct. And that's where I think this post-mortem meeting again is not to solve the problem, is to be able to identify and think about them so you later can bring into solving those problems.
Yep. So you've gone through, you've done all your capture, you've gathered the feedback, you've kind of processed through the feedback. How do you tackle getting into the problem solving part? And I don't want us to go into the full detail of that because we've been at this an hour, and I think this almost becomes a second episode
I
of
think,
getting
and I
into
was
the
going to say that is almost a
yeah.
second episode where we do that because it's now sit with the separate or different heads of
Mm-hmm.
departments and decide, is this a project that we need to do or not? And and I think that's now more project management. That's really part of the postmortem. That's not part of the postmortem. It's actually what come after with all that is something different. And but I will be more than happy to come and discuss that as a follow-up event. And what happened now that you have all these 60 ideas, 100, whatever, what
Mm-hmm.
you do after that.
Yeah, the where I was kind of, leading you along with that was I agree completely. This is not the place to start doing that troubleshooting. And matter of fact, it is absolutely not the place to do it after you've been
Correct.
gathering the problems because there's no clarity of thought. And that group is a large enough group of thoughts and ideas, whether it's an individual or if it's actual bodies, that things will derail very quickly.
Right.
The process of brainstorming problem solutions
That
needs to
should
be
come much
focused.
later.
Right,
Mhm.
that needs to be focused. So if we take those big areas that I was talking about earlier, like food or parking or whatever, that's when you have a separate session with that
Right.
group who
Mhm.
can impact, who can actually make a physical difference with those particular problems. And you bring the results of that to them and say, okay, how do we solve these? Are they solvable? Are they systematic or emblematic of a much larger issue? Do they touch on other areas? That's where that facilitation takes the next step because you're bridging those gaps between them. The last thing you want to do, though, is have people who don't have direct impact on potential problem solutions providing a lot of input in those very early stages. They're welcome to provide input,
Later.
right? But it also, at that later point, you explain to them you can provide all the opinions you want and they will be heard, but do not assume that they will be implemented. And that's a tough nut for a lot of people to crack, and it's difficult for a lot of people to swallow to say, "Hey, wait, I'm going to give you an idea and you're not going to put into practice." No, it's
Maybe
very
not.
possible.
Yeah.
It's very possible. And it may be because that was discussed before and these are the implications of it. It may be that it's not a high enough priority. There may be any number of different things that cause something to be pushed off to the side. But being pushed off to the side doesn't mean that it's lost.
Correct.
So that capture, I have that conversation all the time with people when I go up to the club area, is I'll be talking. Somebody will come up, hey, you should have done this, and we should have done that, and they should solve this problem. I'm like, yeah, you're absolutely right. Write it down, send it in to us. And that's the compelling thing I tell people all the time. I'm like, you can tell me and you can tell everybody else all day long, but until you're willing to put the effort in to write it down and send it in with your name attached, it's not going to get consideration. You have to have a little skin in the game too. You can't just randomly run around to people and say, "Oh, we should have done this, we should have done that." That doesn't solve any issues. That's just putting yourself up on a pedestal to say, "Oh, well, I must be a problem solver because I saw all
Right.
these things." No, fine. Then put your name to it. Put it on paper, put it in digital, send it in, and
And
then we can
send it
look at
in.
it.
Yep.
So,
But I think this is like, as you said, we run our time,
mhm.
but let's make this the next week, because
Yes.
this is important now, what you're going to do, because these are very large projects. And in a lot of these conversations, we tend to talk more about smaller projects than these
Mhm.
massive and or multiple repeated projects as we have. So let's do that and continue that discussion next week. But for now, follow us where you like to listen to podcasts, like us or subscribe to us and leave us a review. You can also interact with us on personalproductivity.club. There is a channel for the Cross Platform podcast. We are Augusto Pinaud and our Gelwicks. See you next time on your favorite device. Thank you.